Okay, great. Thank you, guys. It is straight up noon, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Let me move my camera over a little bit. I'll go ahead and get started. If you have questions, I will try to watch the chat room. As questions come up, I will leave time at the end for some questions if you want to put some in the chat room and I don't see it. For those of you who know me personally and have my cell phone, text me if I don't see something that you think I need to jump in and do. But without further ado, I will go ahead and get started. Thanks, guys, for joining us today. We're going to talk a little bit about autism and inclusion and understanding sort of the basics on how we can be a more inclusive society and bring people of all types into the work that we do. So we've got some goals. Why is it not advancing? Our goals today are to become a little bit more familiar with intellectual and developmental disabilities, to understand how some of those particular disabilities may affect how a person acts or reacts in their own environment, and also work together to try to identify some ways that we can provide more integration and inclusion into our work lives and our personal lives and our communities. So let's start with when we talk about who are people with disabilities. When we talk about, historically speaking, we talk about people with disabilities, a lot of times we hear people say, people who suffer from the tragedy of birth defects. And, you know, saying a phrase like that is pretty demeaning to a person with a disability who doesn't see themselves as suffering. And that's pretty much us putting our own feelings and associations with a disability. A paraplegic hero who struggles to become normal again. Many of you who know me know that normal is not a word that would be used to describe me. And also when we sort of make heroes out of people with disabilities who are doing things that any person could do, it's also pretty demeaning. Something that comes to mind pretty quickly is whenever there's like people who go viral online, you know, in the age of social media and things that we have, where it's like, I know that I've seen the young man who made a bunch of 3-pointers and was called in at the end of a game that they were already winning by 1 million and made a bunch of 3-pointers at the end. And he was this great big hero. And I'm not sure that same situation would have gone viral had that child not had a disability. And so again, we're like, we don't expect a person with a disability to do something that a person typically could do. And so that can sometimes come out as, while probably very well-meaning, seems pretty offensive to someone who might have a disability. And also victims who fight to overcome their challenges. We don't have victims, people aren't victimized because of a disability. So really, when we talk about people with disabilities, and we're going to talk about prevalence here in just a little bit, people who have disabilities are moms and our dads and their sons and daughters and employees, employers and friends and neighbors and students and teachers and scientists and doctors and actors and presidents and everyone in between. To put it very, very bluntly, people with disabilities are us. Like we are inclusive of all people, and people with disabilities make up and are part of most groups. So let's talk specifically about autism for just a second, and then we'll kind of get into some more inclusive things. Autism is a spectrum disorder, considered a developmental disability, and it causes social, communication, and behavioral challenges. Those 3 things must be present in order for a diagnosis of autism to be made. So there's often nothing about how a person with autism looks that sets them apart. So we often see what we call visible disabilities. So somebody who might use some device like a walker or a wheelchair, or someone who is clearly without sight. And so we make accommodations in all environments to make sure that those individuals are included. Things like ramps, things like elevators, general ADA compliance is very much written for a person with a physical disability. But whenever we talk about somebody with an invisible disability like autism, sometimes those accommodations are a lot harder to make because a person doesn't know what those accommodations should be, or a person doesn't even know that the person has a disability because, again, it's invisible. So when we look at people who have autism, they're going to communicate, interact, and behave and learn in ways that are very different from people who are neurotypical instead of being neurodiverse. The way that they learn and think and problem solve might be very different. Person with autism doesn't necessarily all have an intellectual disability. A person with autism can range in their intellectual ability from gifted to very challenged, depending on any comorbid disabilities that are associated along with. Some people with autism need a lot less help in their daily lives, and some need a whole lot more. The diagnosis of autism now includes lots of other conditions where it used to be these were separated out. PDD, NOS, Asperger's syndrome, those are all now considered just autism spectrum disorder. So the formal diagnosis of autism, and I alluded just a minute ago that there has to be 3 things available or 3 things present in order to garner a diagnosis. Deficits in communication across multiple contexts. So you can't just have this communication deficit in one area, like at school or just at home or church or whatever. Persistent deficits in social interaction. And again, those are in multiple contexts. And restrictive, repetitive patterns of behavior. So some behavioral quirk or abnormality or interest or activity that's out there that might set them apart. And again, those are in multiple contexts as well. There are also 3 levels of an autism spectrum disorder, and these are called functional levels. So level 1 requires some support, and so they might need just a little assistance in some activities of daily living. For level 2, these individuals require substantial support. So again, a little bit more assistance than typical. And then level 3 requiring very substantial support. And so these are individuals who maybe couldn't live independently in the community or may need a lot of supports in order to do so. So let's talk about prevalence of autism whenever we talk about how often we see autism occur in our communities. And these are numbers just from the United States. And so in the mid-1980s, it was 1 in 2,500, that diagnosis prevalence. In 2006, the CDC estimated 1 in 166. And in 2006, that was close to the beginning of my career in working with kids with autism. And so that's sort of the number that sticks out to me because that was what it was when I began. So 1 in 166. In 2007, 1 in 130. In 2010, 1 in 110. 14, 1 in 68, in 2018, 1 in 59, and just recently, 2020, 1 in 54, and most recently, the CDC has estimated that 1 in 44 individuals are on the autism spectrum in the United States. Just another little interesting tidbit is that 4 boys to every 1 girl is diagnosed with autism. So we see this far more prevalent in boys rather than girls. So why do we see this increase? Why do we see this increase in diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder? It remains unclear when you look at the diagnostic and statistical manual of mental disorders, unclear whether the higher rates reflect increased awareness. And so when we talk about that increased awareness, when you say the word autism in the community, it is no longer something that not a lot of people know about, especially when you look at a prevalence of 1 in 44, where everyone is affected or knows someone who has autism. And so people are far more aware of it, far more aware of what it looks like and how it impacts life. We also see a lot more people who could tip off maybe a potential diagnosis of autism. So teachers are far more aware, pediatricians are far more aware, and family members are far more aware of what that looks like and might end up making a referral for screening or diagnosis. Differences in study methodology, so how we look at autism and where that lies, and then also a true increase in the number. So we don't really know what's going on. It's likely probably a little bit of all of this and a clearer, more broad diagnostic criteria where, like I said in the slide before, things that might have been differentially diagnosed are now all falling on the autism spectrum. And even prior to that, there were, language disorders or sensory integration disorders, or some of those things might have been diagnosed individually, when now most of those kids are getting this diagnosis of autism. So this is the actual formal, when we talk about a formal diagnosis of autism, this is what it looks like in the DSM. And so we look at symptoms of autism must be present in early developmental period, but they might not manifest until those social demands exceed limited capacities. And so it's hard to say that like a baby has autism, because we don't see that language developed yet developmentally, where they're not making those marks or reaching those gains. Those individual symptoms have to be clinically significant and have impairment in social, occupational, and other important areas of functioning. And they're not better explained by a different disability. And so if it's almost kind of a rule out moment, if there's a different disability that might be comorbid or instead of autism, that better identifies what an individual has or what their diagnosis might be. So we're going to break each of these three things down and talk about what does each of these look like. So what does a social communication deficit look like? And so I'd like to start this section of the talk to remind everyone that, I know it's overstated, but if you know one person with autism, then you know one person with autism. And so the characteristics that I am getting ready to describe here don't happen with all people with autism. They may not happen at all with a person with autism that you might know. These are just some similar characteristics that are often seen, but again, there are no blanket statements. Everyone is different, just like everyone else. And so as we go through this, try to keep that in mind, that we're not necessarily talking about every person with autism has all of these things. And so when we look at that those social and communication deficits, what does it look like? And so one of the first things that are noticed is a poor eye contact or joint attention. If you talk to a person who has autism, who's able to, and there have been lots of books written and lots of perspectives of people, and we're going to talk about actually autistic a little later, those individuals who say, if you ask me a question, but also want me to look at you and answer it, you're going to have to pick one or the other. Like, I'm not going to be able to look at you in the eye and answer the question. It's not that they're unable, it's just more difficult. And that joint attention is looking at something that is interesting to you and getting the attention of someone else without saying a word and bringing their attention to that thing. And so years ago, I had a friend who lived sort of on the north end of Springfield, near where our local airport is. And they were playing outside. She had two sons. Her youngest son had a diagnosis of autism. Her oldest did not. And they were outside playing. They were very used to planes sort of flying low over their backyard. But in this particular instance, it was a military aircraft, and it was over very low over their backyard, to the point where all of them stopped what they were doing and looked up at the sky at the bottom of this airplane that was very, very close to them. Her oldest son, who did not have a diagnosis of autism, looked at her, looked at the plane, looked at her, looked at the plane, which was his way of like, are you seeing what I'm seeing? Are you catching this, Mom? Like, this is really cool. Her son with autism, she looked at him and he was simply looking at the plane. He did not engage her in joint attention. He was not interested in sharing that with her. He saw it and that was enough. He didn't engage. And so that joint attention, seeing that early is a sign sometimes. A failure to develop appropriate relationships with people, a preoccupation with special interests. So rigid and inflexible conversations are likely. Again, not with all people with autism, but sometimes. And so, here at Hope, with some of our students that we serve, we see kids who are very interested in particular topics like video games or YouTube clips, or even lawnmowers and snowblowers and their brands, and, really wanting to talk about things that are interesting to them and not being super open to a change in topic. There's also a lack sometimes of social reciprocity. And so this is like being able to put your feet into the shoes of another person, not being able to have it back and forth real easily with another human being. So spontaneously sharing enjoyment with another person or taking turns sometimes is a deficit we see. And also just sort of one-sided conversations where they'll go, an individual who might have a diagnosis might just start talking about whatever they're interested in and not really be very interested in the things that you're either replying with or trying to change that topic to. More of that emotional reciprocity is an unusual way of offering comfort, or maybe even sometimes an inability or even a lack of awareness that offering comfort would be needed or requested. A restricted range of affect or expression. And so this is just sort of what I call having sort of a blank face, a robot face, where there's not a lot of, you don't see a lot of facial expressions that come there, and an appearance of resisting closeness. And I feel like this goes hand in hand with one of those fallacies of autism, is that people with autism don't like to be close with other people or have intimate relationships or love well. And none of that is true. Anyone who's ever known a person with autism, which is probably almost all of us, right, know that there is no lack of love there, and there's no lack of closeness or emotion. It's just sometimes it may look a little bit different. Poor perspective taking. And so difficulty inferring how other people are feeling and looking at their face and seeing how they might feel, or talking about topics that may, if you have something tragic that's happened in your life, the people around you are probably not going to be bringing that up a lot. And a person who might have this poor perspective taking may not see any difference or any reason why not to bring those things up. It's really just that theory of mind, or the understanding that other people are thinking something differently than what you are thinking, is sometimes limited. Also, that difficulty in seeing what a person's face is, or what a person's body language is expressing. A person who is on the autism spectrum may not read another person really well, or be able to sort of glean what a body language is telling them, whether that, and sometimes that can end up being dangerous. And we see a lot of individuals who have interactions with police or ambulance or fire department, things like that, where it's just a lack of understanding that a person with autism doesn't understand not to just walk up to or get out of their car when a police officer pulls them over, or walk up to somebody briskly because they want to talk to them. It can lead to misunderstandings and sometimes even into a dangerous situation. We also often see a lack of or delayed onset of spoken language. And I know that our chief of clinical services, Lee, will talk about how a lot of the younger kids that come into our outpatient clinics come mostly because of a lack of ability to express for expressive language. And so that's really both in our clinic operations and in our schools and residential programs, that communication is one of the first things we want to teach, because we'll talk a little bit later about an inability to communicate often leads to misunderstanding, obviously, and sometimes that maladaptive behavior. We'll also see stereotypic or repetitive use of language sometimes. Oftentimes a child with autism will have echolalia, which can be immediate or delayed. And if I say, "Hi, Amanda," I'll say, "Hi, Michael," and he'll look at me and say, "Hi, Michael." And then, "Hi, Amanda." It can be that immediate echo. And sometimes we have kids who have delayed echolalia. And a lot of times we can call that scripting. And they'll maybe repeat a phrase from a TV show or a movie. And a lot of times it fits in with the conversation that you're having. Like, it has the right emotional tone, or, sort of fits. And so an individual might use that in order to communicate the best way they know how. We often see some receptive language deficits as well, and a tendency for a very literal interpretation of language. And so when we train our employees to work with kids with autism, we say, joke telling is not going to get too far for you, and being sarcastic or saying things like raining cats and dogs, or a trick up your sleeve. Those things are not going to land as far as a joke goes. And we may end up with a lot of confusion, because our kiddos may at times take them very, very literally and say, what do you mean it's raining cats and dogs? I see no cats nor dogs. And so we want to make sure that we're actually saying what we mean and not being sarcastic about things. The other way is that receptive language they'll interpret it very literally. An example I have is, so Johnny, all he wants for Christmas is rollerblades, and he writes letters about rollerblades, and he writes a letter to Santa about rollerblades. He tells his parents all he wants is rollerblades. He draws pictures of rollerblades. He cuts out pictures from magazines and tapes them all over his room that he wants, and all the different types of rollerblades out there. He tells grandparents, he tells his teacher, all of his classmates, he wants rollerblades. They go to the mall and see the Santa, and he tells Santa there, I want rollerblades. Everybody knows that he wants rollerblades. Christmas morning comes and he tears down the stairs and there's a package under the tree, and he opens it up and it's a basketball. And he says, thanks, Mom, I love it. Now, does he love the basketball? And most people would say, no, he doesn't. He said it, but he doesn't. And a person with autism might say, yes, he does, because that's what he said he did. He said he loved it, so he must love it. That's that very literal interpretation of language. Also, sometimes we see atypical inflection or intonation or atypical prosody. And so an example of that is when we put different emphasis on different words in a sentence, and it changes the meaning of a sentence. So if I say, he didn't clean his room, that typically means that someone else cleaned his room. If I say he didn't clean his room, that means like he should have, but he didn't. He didn't clean his room, which means he did something else. Probably he messed up his room. Or he didn't clean his room, which probably means he cleaned something else, but not his room. All of those sentences are exactly the same, but all of those sentences mean something very different. And a person with autism may just hear he didn't clean his room, period. And there's not an inflection there that changes the meaning of that sentence. More of that social communication stuff, so abnormal play. And so a lot of times we see kids who are playing with toys, not in the way that toys are meant to be played with. So a Barbie might be stripped down completely naked because it's very smooth and cool to the touch, and may spin Barbie by her hair, creating helicopter Barbie moments because that looks cool whenever you look at the light through that spinning Barbie. Typically you see little boys who have cars, and, and they're doing, patterns in the carpet and roads and ramps and all the things with cars. And a lot of times you see kids with autism who might play with cars, flip it over, spin the wheels, look at the light reflection in the bottom of it. Not just playing with toys or items that they're not typically meant to be played with. Unimaginative play is often something that we see a lack of, or we don't see imaginative play, we see unimaginative play. And so if you kind of sneak up on kids between the ages of 4 and 6 or so, if they're in their rooms, a lot of times they're talking, especially if they're by themselves, and they're playing with their dolls and they're acting out stories or plays or talking to themselves, or like they're pretending to, or they're playing house with friends or playing, those sort of role play games. And those are all imaginative games where the kids are putting voices and pretending to be other people and pretending scenes and all of that. That's all imaginative. You're less likely to see that imaginative play in kiddos with autism. You'll also see a lot more solitary play. And so working just on their own, playing with toys by themselves and not at all being bothered that they're not playing with another person. And so a lot of times we have to sort of set up contrived moments where we're sort of forcing interaction, where like the toy doesn't work unless they have a different part, and that other part is with another person, another child. And so this child is forced to interact over here with the other kiddo in order to get that toy to work. And so we have to really teach some of that teamwork and play skills of playing with your neighbor. We also see a failure a lot of times to imitate patterns and observed behavior. And so it's important that we are cognizant of this. Every single thing that you've ever learned in your life you've learned through imitation. Most everything. You learned how to talk by imitating the person who raised you. You learned how to walk by imitating, again, people around you and those who raised you. You learned how to use a toll booth because of the car in front of you, or because you rode with somebody else who used a toll booth and then you know how to do it. Just about everything that we know how to do, we learned by imitating someone else do it, down to when you go to a new restaurant and it's just opened and you've never been there before, and you walk in the door and you don't know if you're supposed to sit down and be waited on, if you order at the counter, if somebody seats you, if you wait to be seated, you know, all of those things, you know, you don't know. And you learn by watching the person in front of you. It's like, okay, I see what they're doing, so therefore that's what I will do too. If they just walk in and sit down, that's what I'm going to do. If they wait for a hostess, that's fine. If they walk to a counter and order, that's what I'll do. And so if you think about pretty much everything in your life, you learn to do it by watching other people do it. And if you are cognizant and aware of that kids with autism often don't imitate well, that kind of will give you a lot of awareness as to some of the challenges a person with autism might have. You know, they're not going to be able to imitate just what you do. So those are those foundational skills, kind of those learning to learn skills that we've got to teach a lot of kids, that specifically we have to teach imitation before we can start even teaching other things, because we've got to teach them to be aware of another person, to see what they're doing, and then do what they're doing, which is the very basics of learning, is learning how to imitate someone else to do anything. So talking about some of this, moving on away from those social and communication deficits and moving into a repetitive or restricted behavior, what does that look like? It can look like movements, you know, and a lot of times the kids that I know that we work with here in our schools and in our residential program, we see a lot of stereotypical movement, a lot of rocking or hand flapping or twirling, but it doesn't have to be that pronounced. You know, it can just be kind of a minor movement or minor, you know, repetitive thing that they're doing. It can be an excessive interest in a particular object or an activity. And again, this is a pervasive interest where it's throughout all environments, and these interests can often even interrupt some other typical interactions. A great preoccupation with details and information. So lining things up by size, by color, by alphabet, you know, whatever, keeping things very lined up and organized. We see spinning wheels, twirling objects. I talked a little bit earlier about helicopter Barbie. You know, those things are pretty typical. Squinting eyes, looking at things from the corner of the eye. All of those we see pretty often in the kids that we serve with autism here at Hope. And those kind of fall into that repetitive or restrictive behavior category. But please keep in mind, as we're talking about these things, like I said at the beginning, this is a spectrum. And so an individual can be on this side of the spectrum for some language communication, but this side of the spectrum for repetitive or restrictive behavior, or vice versa. They can be all over. Any person can be anywhere on the spectrum. And so that's why it's so important that you understand that these aren't global references necessarily. We often see also with that repetitive or restrictive behavior an inflexible adherence to rules and routines. And so we often say, whenever we work with some of our kids here, if we know something's coming up in their future, that we do a social story, you know, to kind of have them concretely see these are the things that are about to happen, whether in my upcoming day or next week, or even on a visit we're going somewhere, or moving to a new house, whatever it is. Because if we lay out sort of the rules for a lot of our kids, we will see a better outcome there. And so a difficulty with change, or a desire for sameness, wanting things to follow a particular order that they always have, and there's some uncomfortability there whenever there becomes an interruption, or when the schedule changes or things like that. So implications of that, you know, in any typical school, special events, it's a big deal. When I was in school, it was the best day ever when they rolled in the giant tube TV on the cart with the VCR underneath, because that meant we were going to watch some video, and no matter how awful that video was, it was better than being in class, and it was awesome. But if I am on the autism spectrum and I see that thing come in, and I'm supposed to have math class in the afternoon, and we're going to skip that to watch some movie, that can be very bothersome to a person who's on the spectrum, because you've interrupted and not warned a person about an upcoming activity or a change in the schedule. Think about things like substitute teachers. Teachers are typically very routine-based, and they do the kind of the same thing in the same order all the time. And then you have a substitute teacher come in and it looks very different. And that can very much affect a child with autism who might be in that classroom. For us, when we talk about our, in our clinics or in our schools or our residential program, that staff turnover is hard. A kiddo gets used to working with a particular staff member or clinician, and then we have turnover for whatever reason. Then it can be very disruptive in learning. It can be very disruptive in potential maladaptive behavior and just in general confusion as well. Things like vacations are difficult for families who have kids with autism, again, because it's different. And also have babysitters. And so what we often see a lot when we have kids who are very affected by autism, who might be a level 3, and we have parents who haven't gone out on their own in many, many years, or really even since their kiddo was born, because the ramifications of changing up and having somebody new in their environment would be too great, not worth it to go out. And so we see these things happen all the time, where it's like, don't mess up the routine, to the detriment sometimes of other members of the family. All right, let's talk about sensory differences. And so this is something that we see often affect kids with autism in many different ways. And so those sensory differences can look like sight, smell, taste, touch, hearing, and vestibular differences. A person can have hypersensitivity to some sort of sensory input, or hyposensitivity to a sensory input. So the way that I remember it is hyper with an E means you want less of something with an E. So hypersensitivity to light may mean you want less light. And so, like sharp light beams are not something, or you might want to wear sunglasses. Hyposensitivity with an O means you want more of something. And so hyposensitivity to touch, for example, might mean you're really craving deep pressure or deep tissue massages, or really, wanting physical touch from another person. A person can be hyper or hyposensitive to different senses, all in the same kid. So, or adult. A person might have hypersensitivity to sound, but hyposensitivity to taste, right? And so when we talk about how these things affect our kids and how these things affect people in homes and at school and in their communities, we have to be aware, a lot of times I'm not cognizant of noises in my environment, like music playing in the background or loud, visually chaotic places where I am. And if you have a friend or child or student who's in, say like a mall food court, it can be very distracting and distract a kiddo to the point where they're unable to really even eat and be present in that area because there's just too much input coming through. You'll often see kids who are hypersensitive to sound wear noise canceling headphones. You see kids with sunglasses on, like I said earlier. We have a lot of kids who wear Under Armour or other kinds of compression garments underneath their clothes, sort of on an hourly off and on basis, because they really are requesting and really needing some of that deep pressure stuff. So you'll see kids who are sensory seeking or sensory defensive, where it's, rejecting or really, really looking for it. And sometimes that sensory seeking can end up looking like a maladaptive behavior, especially if there's a language deficit there where a child's not able to communicate, I need more of something, or I need less of something. That can sometimes manifest into an inappropriate behavior. A person might resist hands-on exploratory activities. So years and years ago, I worked with little kiddos with autism when I was in school, in graduate school. And we all had students that we were assigned to that we worked with in sort of a preschool program. And the little girl that I worked with, I didn't realize had some hypersensitivity to touch. And she didn't like to get her hands dirty. She didn't like to put her hands in things. And one of the sort of universal reinforcers we had for a lot of our kids were they liked to play with this big, it was like like a sandbox or even an empty water table full of beans, dried beans. And a lot of our kids really like to get in there and put their arms in it and play with and let the beans run through their fingers and put them in cups and kind of how you play with sand. But it was with these beans that provided a really interesting sensory input to the kids. She would have zero part of it, none of it. She wanted no part of the beans because she was very hypersensitive to the way that felt. And so we had to find other things that she could be reinforced by. You might have a kid who loves deep pressure, but can't stand light or touch. And so again, every person's different. Every kid is different in what they like and don't like, what they need and don't need. So what else? What else is associated with autism often? We see often a higher likelihood of seizure disorder that comes with autism. We see problems in sleep regulation very often with kids with autism specifically. We see challenges with eating. And a lot of this goes back to some of that sensory defensiveness. It might be a texture issue or a taste issue. Gross and fine motor coordination challenges where the kids are looking a little clumsier, have poor posture. Also, you see a lot of tippy-toe walking sometimes. And some mood disturbance. Those things are often associated along with autism. So when we talk about, I feel like a lot of people have preconceived notions about autism and that kids with autism or adults with autism have behavior issues. And so I just want to be very clear that sometimes an autism diagnosis might preclude a person to have more oppositional, aggressive, or self-injurious behavior. But it's not because of the autism. It's because of some symptom of autism, like an inability to communicate well, might not allow a person to either gain access to something or get out of something that they don't want to be part of. That frustration can often lead to a maladaptive behavior. It's not because of the autism. It's because of the inability to communicate what they want, need, or want to get out of. Every behavior that is exhibited by any human being in the world, by you, by me, by a child with autism, every behavior has a function or a reason why it happens. And oftentimes we say, well, the behavior came out of nowhere. I promise you it did not. And so when we talk about things like a substitute teacher, the substitute teacher comes into the room and seats the child in a chair that he doesn't usually sit on and switches reading for math, and then dismisses for lunch 5 minutes early. And then the kid loses his mind. And that substitute teacher says, it came from nowhere. And it's like, actually, no, there were several, antecedents to this behavior that maybe we just didn't see or we didn't pick up on. But if you dig in, I promise you, you will find an intellectual disability. We want to make sure that we're, like in the nuttiest of nutshells, we want to make sure that we are able to teach a child or an adult to communicate what they need rather than communicating it in a way that could be perceived as dangerous or unruly. So vaccinations, this was part of a big debate many years ago, but I feel like there are still people who like to tout that autism is caused by vaccination. So just to be very, very clear, there is literally no evidence that autism is caused by vaccinations. There's no causal relationship between thimerosal, which was the ingredient identified in this study to impair neurological function. The incidence of autism continues to rise despite thimerosal being removed. And also in the Wakefield study, where this all sort of came from, 10 of the 13 authors of that study have retracted their names from it because they basically said it's bunk. And so I want to make sure that everyone is very aware of that. Prognosis of autism. So it is a lifelong disorder. A person's not ever going to be cured of autism. They might need specialized support throughout life, or they might attain functioning with some supports and tools and early intervention. They may, you would never know, but a person is still going to have autism underneath it all. When we talk about the prognosis for an individual who does have a diagnosis of autism, improvement is greatly influenced by a few factors. Early and intensive intervention, I can't say that enough. And so you have a child who has diagnosis of autism, getting them early and intensive treatment, a lot of times will yield really great benefits. Kiddos who are mainstreamed in school and who are able to pretty much just be a neurotypical person in the universe. Having advocating caregivers, which I feel like a lot of people who work in our field are like, oh, because these parents who like demand the most and always want to have a meeting and always want to talk about it, you know, those parents get a bad reputation. But the truth is, those are the best parents. Those are the parents who are keeping all of us on our toes. Those are the parents who are making us think outside the box about how best to serve each child individually. And those are the parents who get things for their kids, period. And so if you are a parent of a child with autism or guardian of a child with autism, be a jerk. It's important that you maintain that level of advocacy for the person that you love. Seeing joint attention by the age of 4 and some language by the age of 5 are going to impact improvement and generally a higher cognitive ability. I feel like here at Hope, and especially in our school and residential programs, we are a bit biased because all of our children not only they may have autism, but all of our kids have a comorbid intellectual disability that goes along with that. And so we don't get a clear picture of what autism looks like in its pure form. And so we want to make sure that when we're talking about kids with autism, it doesn't necessarily or always or even often go with a diagnosis of an intellectual disability as well. So some myths associated with autism. They're not Rain Man. I know that sounds crazy. And I realized my age also not too long ago when I was doing this talk to some new hires, and I said something about Rain Man and not one person in the room knew what I was talking about. What I'm saying here is Rain Man did a nice job of depicting autism along with savant syndrome. So the ability to count the matches or to count cards in Vegas, or, you know, having these specialized skills. A person with autism doesn't necessarily have that. They do if they have savant syndrome along with, but they don't have some special abilities. They're not caused by refrigerator mothers. And this wasn't that long ago where like in the 60s and 70s, some medical professionals said, your child has autism because you weren't loving enough. Now, I don't know, as a parent myself, I feel like that would be a pretty heartbreaking thing to hear, that I caused something because I didn't love a child enough, and that is just absolutely not true. It's not caused by vaccinations. It's not cured by special diets or drugs. Now, caveat here, autism is not going to be cured, the word cured there, by special diets or drugs. However, if you have a child who has a legitimate like gut issue and you treat that with a special diet, like a gluten-free or dairy-free diet or anything along those lines, and you see improvements in maladaptive behavior, well, then you've relieved a symptom. You've relieved pain or discomfort, and that pain or discomfort might have been leading to some inappropriate behavior, but the autism is still there. Or drugs. There is no drug for autism, but there are drugs to treat symptoms of autism, you know, to treat some, you know, maybe depressive symptoms or obsessive symptoms or compulsive symptoms of autism. But I think of autism often like the common cold. A cold, you can treat symptoms of. You can treat sneezing and headache and runny nose and a cough, but underneath, you're still going to have a cold. Kind of a similar situation. And it doesn't start at the age of 3. Again, kind of referenced a little bit earlier to sometimes that the developmental milestones aren't supposed to hit until about 3. And so that's when a lot of people notice autism. Not so much anymore because we're getting better and better at reaching that earlier in life, but you know, it doesn't start at 3. Okay, so talk about how people with disabilities are everywhere. People with disabilities constitute America's largest minority group. And people don't often think about people with disabilities as being part of a minority group. Those people are, they're part of all genders, sexual orientations, ages, religions, socioeconomic statuses, and ethnicities. It's a huge group of people. Like other minority groups, they're often on the receiving end of societal misunderstanding and prejudice and discrimination. These are one of those moments where we need to be very aware of our own behavior and how we're treating people who might look or act differently from us, but there is no better or worse. It's just simply different. When we talk about old and inaccurate descriptors, when we talk about disabilities and use words that are now really frowned upon and looked upon as really derogatory terms, we perpetuate those negative stereotypes. You know, we are the ones who are continuing this level of discrimination by referring to people with disabilities as less than or using words that are not appropriate. We have to remember that a disability is often simply a medical diagnosis. And the truth is, it's not anybody's business unless they want it to be somebody's business, or if somebody actually really needs to know. Just like you don't want to be known by your psoriasis or your gynecological history, we don't want to categorize children based on just simply a diagnosis. The disability isn't the problem. Kind of society and the way that we look at disability, it's like, what's this individual's problem? What's the problem here? And it's like there's not a problem. There's a great opportunity here for us to learn, a great opportunity for us to make some accommodations. But people who are neurotypical don't spend a lot of time talking about their problems and the things that are, quote, wrong with them. We don't say I have a seeing problem. We say I wear contacts or I wear glasses. But again, the disability isn't the problem. We talk about something's wrong, or many times in a long time ago when I used to work with families who had little kids and I'd work in their homes, they would say, we knew there was something wrong when, and, I would stop them right there and say, we don't know a whole lot about receptive language with kids with autism, even if their expressive language is not there. They could be understanding every single thing you're saying. And so we want to make sure that we're not taking advantage of that, talking about kids in front of kids, especially if we're talking in a derogatory manner about kiddos. I mean, just always put your perspective on the other side of things. And how would you feel if those that were close to you only ever talked about things that were, quote, wrong with you all the time? That would be, I would think, very detrimental to long-term mental health. So a disability is a function of an environment. And so this is kind of an interesting perspective on things. But so when I was in school, I worked for a camp, and the camp was for kids and adults with developmental and physical disabilities. And every week, the population of camper would change. Whenever we had some adults who did not have an intellectual disability, but did have a physical disability. So these were people who used wheelchairs or walkers, or some other assistive device in order to mobilize or even communicate sometimes. This camp that we worked at was not a camp where we just kind of sat around a campfire and hung out and made, noodle necklaces. This was a camp where we went rock climbing and rappelling and canoeing and caving and slept in the woods under the stars. I mean, it was a real camp. And so we had a lot of adaptive equipment, especially for some of those more active activities where those adults would be able to go rock climbing with the adaptive equipment that they had, and they'd be successful at it. At the same time, I was not great at rock climbing. And if I would try to use their equipment, I was unable to do so. And so in that environment, I actually was unable. I was the person with a disability, while the people who around me had no problem climbing the face of that rock. And so whenever we are providing those welcoming and accessible environmental supports and tools and accommodations, that disability tends to disappear in that environment. And so the truth is, that's our job. Our job is to, provide those tools and those accommodations so that that disability doesn't affect them in the community that they're in. So we're going to focus on what kids can do. Like, I'm not going to talk about all the things that I'm unable to do in the future. I'm going to focus solely on things I can. We have a tendency to focus with our kids on things that they cannot do. Like they cannot reach this IEP goal, or they cannot do these things, when we just need to reframe and say they can do these things and we're going to build on this, and they can say these words and we're going to build on them. So there's an interesting thing happening right now where historically we've taught people first language or person first language. And person first language is when we talk about the person before the disability. So a person with autism is historically how we describe a person with autism or a person on the spectrum, rather than saying the disability first and the person. We say things like the labels that they need are their names, and we don't need to describe a person by their disability. More recently, within the last, I would say 5-10 years or so, we've got a lot of advocates that are against person first language. Those advocates imply that can actually be detrimental to a cultural identity of a person with a disability or with autism specifically. The hashtag actually autistic is one that I'm seeing a lot more often, and I'm seeing a lot more often in social media and in blog postings of people who have autism, who are talking about autism. And so as an ally of a person with autism, it might be frowned upon for me to do even a talk like this because I do not have autism. And truly a person with autism is going to be better talking about themselves and characteristics associated with themselves and people like them. The slogan for Actually Autistic is nothing about us without us. And so truly, whenever we talk about person first language versus identity first language, the best rule of thumb is really when in doubt, ask, like how do you like to be referred to? What's your preferred people first language or identity first language? Person first language is still not always offensive. And I think most people would understand that you're actually trying not to be offensive by using person first language. But if you are corrected by a person or an advocate or a person who's actually autistic and they say, actually, I'm autistic, I don't have autism, then respect that and respect their identity and their cultural identity. There are clear exceptions in the disability community, specifically with the deaf community. That are not people with deafness. These are capital D deaf people. A lot in the blind community, and overwhelmingly and more often we're seeing that in the autistic community as well. People who want to be referred to their disability as part of them and part of their culture. So when you talk to a person, these are getting into some of these ways that we can bring people in. We want to talk to the person that you're working with or that you're interacting with, not to a staff person that's with him, to a parent that's with him, to a friend that's with him, or an interpreter. You talk to the person. Now, if they need help formulating answers or responding or things like that, then maybe they're going to rely on the person that's with them. But if you want to tell a person with developmental disability that they have a really cute top on, you should tell them and not say, hey, look, Sally's got a cute top on. Tell Sally. Sally would really like to know that. And making eye contact, because it shows respect when you're looking at a person and communicating with them. Most of the things I've talked about today are based in some evidence-based research and diagnostic criteria. This slide is not. This is just the Amanda Brott show right now on this slide. I like to think, I'm a big believer in karma and a big believer in sort of what goes around. A person can become a person with a disability at any time. Split-second accident, during aging process, et cetera. So we are all going to depend on another human being. Either we already have or we will in the future. And how are we all going to want to be treated? And so I hope that we're able to, in our own clinics and in our own group homes and in our own classrooms, we're able to sort of get that down to the staff members who are providing that very direct care, that how would you want to be treated if these roles were reversed? I think it's incredibly important to keep that in mind. Best advice, ask. There aren't any universal ways to make accommodations for individuals who are autistic or who have autism. And so we want to make sure that we're asking the questions. How can I make this more comfortable for you? How can we make this more enjoyable of an experience for you? Do you need a break? Or, hey, you know what? It's quieter over here. Do you want to come to this area? Do you want to go take a break, go for a quick walk, or help me organize this? Or can I show you pictures of what's about to happen? Those are all accommodations that we can offer. And I'm very happy to see a lot of businesses and, especially kind of like recreational areas. So like the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum, movies, things like that are offering sensory sensitive days, or places like Disney and Universal Studios and things like that have areas where a person can go and take a sensory-free break. That's a quiet, kind of dimly lit area. And you see those places popping up all the time. And that's simply because we are becoming, I believe, a more accepting society of people who just process things a little bit differently. Start young, integrate early, talk to your own children who are neurotypical about people who aren't, and how we are all far more the same than we are different. If you start that conversation early in life, there is a less likelihood of having some of those preconceived notions later on. Like I said, more similar than we are different. This is a picture of a few of our kids enjoying things that every kid in the world enjoys.